Hello, everyone. Today I'm welcoming Mark Frein, Chief People Officer at Lambda School. Mark, welcome to Making Remote Work.
Oh, thank you, Yulia. I'm happy to be here.
Mark, could you introduce yourself, your background, your experience, and definitely if you can pinpoint your experience in remote distributed working, that would be amazing.
For sure. So, Mark Frein, and here I am in my office in Austin, Texas. This has been the place where I've worked for the most part for the last 7 years. I've spent most of the last decade working largely remote from my teams, the places that I worked. In a couple of times over the last 10 years, I've also worked for exclusively remote companies. So prior to Lambda School, I was chief people officer at a company called Envision, which is amongst the top probably 3 to 4 largest all remote companies in the world. So remote work is kind of part of my blood now and my bones. The only thing right now that is challenging remote is, since we're all remote, by force, I can't get a haircut. So I'm sensitive to how badly my hair is starting to look here at home. And my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, is really anxious to cut my hair this weekend, which I'll have to think very carefully about whether or not that's a good idea.
But you might end up bald.
I might end up having to buzz cut myself. But no, I've been working largely remote for quite some time. I've been thinking about not just remote work, but remote life for probably 10 years. I've done some writing on the subject. I've done some speaking on the subject prior to this call, obviously. And for me, it's just all about what is changing about our lives when it comes to how we interface digitally with other people. So in addition to working remote and managing my teams remote, I'm a musician. I did an album with a remote band at one point. I play remote. A lot of my friends and I go online and we do games together. So I go back and think about the beginnings of all this for me were, now 20 years ago plus, when the first massively multiplayer online role-playing games came out. And for some of us, at least my age, kind of a Gen Xer, this was the first remote wave, because all of a sudden you had a world opened up to you. It happened to be a fantastical world like World of Warcraft, but you began to see what was possible to connect people together to do, at least at that point, play remote. And Second Life followed on the heels of that very quickly. So for a lot of us in the world, especially in the more formal business world, this whole remote thing is very new. For some of us, especially people who have been I think on the gaming front, the computer gaming front, remote has been something we've been doing for a long time. I remember trying to hack together modem-based games in the early '90s to play with my friends, because I moved to go to grad school and I moved to go to work, and I would keep in contact with my friends. And I remember the little screech of the AOL connection, the modem connection. I mean, a lot of people don't even know what that is anymore. But the little screech and the satisfying, resolution sound when a modem talked to another modem, and then I could play a game with one of my friends online. And so for me, in a funny way, this isn't new, and as the tools have gotten more and more sophisticated, it's just made it easier and easier and easier. But I've been I guess puzzling over what this means for us as a human species in some ways for a long time.
And Mark, you are one of those rare people, because I don't believe we are many, who manage to integrate life and work, especially remote life and work, very nicely. Now, I do wonder, does it feel the same now while we're going through this pandemic, or is it a bit different from what you've experienced before? Are there differences?
That's a great question. I'll offer a perspective, but I'm probably not a good person to ask, because for me, nothing has changed really. What's changed for me day to day is I can't go down and have my coffee break at Starbucks. So one of the rituals that I have as a remote worker working out of my home is I'll go on a morning walk and go sit in the Starbucks for half an hour, and I miss the Starbucks people, and so. But for me, life hasn't changed very much. If anything, this is going to sound strange, but if anything, it's gotten slightly better because I'm not traveling. Whereas before, I would get on a plane probably a couple times a month. I haven't gotten on a plane for quite some time. And so, me personally, this has been the way I've been used to living and working for a while. When I think about my colleagues, especially my executive colleagues at Lambda School who have not been working remote, they had a very tough first couple of weeks. I think it's getting better for now, getting easier and better for them now. But for them, it was a very, very hard adjustment going from their rituals of going, even a commute, which of course they didn't love the commute, but they were used to the morning rituals, getting up, getting to office, spending time in office, focusing in the way that they did, and then going back home. And I think when we human beings are creatures of habit, and for a lot of people who have not been habituated to this model of working and living, it's a very hard break. And I think people are resilient. So when I talk to the colleagues of mine that for which remote work was more of a challenge, it's much easier for them now than it was, say, in early March, when at least Lambda, we were pretty early at Lambda School in closing our offices voluntarily. We jumped on the situation quite early. And even then it was interesting in that we weren't sure if we wanted to close that early, but we knew we had a good reason to believe what was going to come, and we wanted to try to keep our employees as safe as possible. So we kind of shut down early, even though some people were worried about the impact on the business, but it proved to be a very wise decision. I think people are learning that remote is tough, but can be done. And I think we'll probably see at the end of this many more companies going all remote, which will be a different kind of challenge. So it'll be hard to get people back again, I think, in some cases.
Especially employees who start to learn that, hey, this is possible and I can do my
this
job
is possible.
And I'm productive.
I'm productive. Maybe I'm more productive sometimes. I get back some aspects of my life that I didn't have, like travel, like commute. That'll be a sort of different reconciliation. Is how do we get people back in offices? Some people I think will want to go back to offices, and some people will recognize that this is a great way to work. So we'll have sort of two adjustment phases, and it'll be interesting to see people go through that other side of it.
Mark, you worked in a company which was all remote, but Lambda, you just told me you were not initially all remote, right? It's e-learning, so part of what's happening between students and educators is remote, but the company in itself, it's not all remote. And you had to help them transition in these 2-3 weeks. And you were the expert in all remote. So can you share some of the things that maybe and actions that you have taken with Lambda to help them go through this period, so others who are listening and are going through the same can maybe borrow and learn from what you are doing?
Sure. Yeah, we had two offices, one in San Francisco, one in Utah, just outside of Salt Lake City. And then about a third, maybe a little more than a third of our employees were remote. Since all of our students learn remote, our instructional staff is entirely remote. So a lot of our employees were very comfortable with remote work. But at the same time, a lot of people were used to going into offices, so it was a little bit of an adjustment. It's funny, I think that there's various degrees of quote unquote expertise on being remote, and a lot of people started publishing things and providing content within the first couple of weeks of sort of the big shutdown, maybe about a month ago. And I wrote a couple things, but I also want to be cautious in that I think those of us who are experts have to be, somewhat humble about it, because nobody's been doing this very long. So expertise is just simply a matter of having done it a little bit longer than other people. And I also, it is also clear that remote work doesn't always come in the same size and shape. So I think you've mentioned that you've watched my interview with Sid, the CEO at GitLab. GitLab has a very specific approach to remote working where they encourage multitasking. Whereas, and this is one thing that he and I talked about, I don't personally feel that that's useful for me. So I train my teams to really focus and shut down distractions while they're trying to be present with people on a call. And of course, there's situations where that's probably more important. If I were having a one-on-one with an employee who was struggling, I'm going to really want to focus and not, be busy over on Slack while I'm trying to listen to them. But I think the key with advice about remote is advice about any change in a human system, which is figure out the strategies to support each other. So one of the things that we did is we created a bunch of new Slack channels. One was a COVID-19 channel, which was just like share news, share, ask questions, share things that you're concerned about. And the other was a remote life channel, where it was just post things that are interesting to you, that are fun, that are strategies, because in some ways the crowd is going to be as helpful as I can be. And I got the channel going, but a lot of people have added other stuff in there as well. And sometimes we just have fun there. We post videos of our animals jumping on us in the middle of a Zoom call, or we, post jokes and snippets and cartoons about remote life. So the way I think about what are strategies that ultimately make remote life work are ironically the same as what makes any kind of life work, whether or not you're in an office or remote, which is being human together. And the best I guess tips are, hey, does something make you feel more together? Do it. Does something seem to get in the way of human connection in the workplace? And then don't do it and revise it. And people have experimented with all sorts of things. I've tried unsuccessfully to have kind of remote breaks and lunches and happy hours, and they often seem to not work that well. I know some people have gotten some variation on that, but I've also tried things that are like remote, literally like asking people if they want to jump on and play a game as staff members, like at the end of the day. That works really well, because there's a lot of systems that have been built to accommodate that kind of activity, whereas we don't like have a remote bar app. Getting together and having food or beverages is not doesn't seem to be solved yet in terms of the remote experience. Whereas, getting on and playing like a virtual board game or, any of that stuff, they have invented really great apps for that. So for me, it's all about what do we have as technologies that seem to work really well in in a digitally connected life. And if we can use those to create great, to create friendships, to sustain relationships, to build new relationships, all that stuff is stuff that I would say is remote positive. And then the demon, the head of the devil you're fighting is isolation with remote work. And anything that tends to increase isolation is something that you have to work to avoid.
That's one of the worries and one of everyone's fears. And then you touched on it with games and maybe remote discussions and just Slack channels for complaining, just anxiety and everything, just releasing all those fears. But Sid said at some point that these companies, and he was referring to yours and GitLab as well, they are one of the most social companies that at least he worked for. How do you make it so? Or what makes it? Do you get any kind of feedback from the employees, whether that's on Slack channel or just directly? What makes them stay in these all remote companies? What makes them consider that, hey, it's still social, right? Even if we don't meet each other. And I've heard stories and I've read stories that you've published and Sid as well, that people meet after 4 years, maybe in a remote camp, or after 1 year, and they hug each other and they cry because they've worked together, but they've never met each other. But still something glues them together. Whereas normal companies, hybrid companies, or non-remote companies believe that being in the office is what glues people together.
Yeah. Well, I think that what you just said, I think, is really interesting and instructive. Where if somebody really believes that being in the office together at the same time is what makes a culture work, I just think they're deluded. I've been in office buildings that are empty of life and energy and positive culture, even though people are sitting 5 feet away from each other and literally knocking elbows. And I've been in offices where people are where there's a sense of vibrancy and a sense of pleasure, and that, so just focusing on the physical environment for a second, because I think it tells us a lot about the remote environment. You can have the same setup, office 1, office 2, radically different expressions of culture and a sense of belongingness and a sense of participation. Why? Because of leadership, because of company values, because of company performance, like all the ingredients that go into the experience of being an employee in an organization, have almost nothing to do with the walls, around it. It has to do with the people connections and the way in which people are encouraged to show up and the way in which people actually do show up. So if we can kind of say for a second, physicality doesn't in and of itself lead to cultural bonding. It's how people live into that building, right? And how people are led in that building that ultimately makes their experience positive or negative. The same is very much true of remote work. I mean, I don't know personally of any of these companies, but I'm sure they're all remote companies that are dreadful, and isolating and not fun, and like the same difference. Those companies are likely, there's problems in the company, there are problems in leadership, cultural inconsistencies, all that kind of stuff. I like to think about the remote work as just like you're compressing lived experience through a digital channel as opposed to through sound waves like in the air, and all that communication is still happening. It's just happening in 2 dimensions as opposed to 3. I'll tell a story maybe as a way of answering this in with a exclamation point. Is when I was at Envision, we had some employees who were in Puerto Rico when the hurricane came through, and we knew that they were in jeopardy to some degree. Luckily, they got out, and they basically looked for any assistance in identifying means to leave, and they put that into a staff Slack channel where all at that point, I think it was like at least 500 employees were, and there was just an outpouring of not only assistance but also emotional support for these 2 families that were living there. And for me, that kind of is indicative of the spirit or ethos of that that era, that company was, people really cared about each other. And being all remote, especially during a time when all remote was very rare, did unify us. Like it was, hey, we're all in this together. Like we're all trying to make all remote work. And that is a very important cultural impact. It's hey, we're all struggling against the same force, which is isolation, and we're all doing it together. When you look at any company and its ability to, I would say, like conquer the all remote reality, do you encourage and permit employees to to share and to be with and to participate and to have voice? That's all you do at successful in-person companies too. For me, it has a lot to do with both a sense of belonging and also a sense of being heard. Like, do I feel like I am welcomed, and do I feel like I have a voice? If you can do that in an in-person company, you will have a very successful culture. If you can do that in a remote company, you will have a very successful culture. If you fail to do that in either environment, it's going to be a problem.
Did you have, do you have the same policy of transparency that GitLab has?
GitLab is famous for how radical they've gone on that. So no, meaning like when I was at Envision, we didn't have that same policy, and Lambda doesn't quite have that same policy either. Lambda is a very transparent company. We share a lot of what's going on with the employee. We share effectively everything that's going on. I think GitLab is famous for documenting literally every single decision. I have a lot of respect for that commitment and the degree to which they are consistent in that commitment. It requires, it almost goes very well with their particular company product as well. Like, it's a documentation company of a kind, like in a storage company. So it meshes very well with their practice. I think the degree of transparency that GitLab embraces is not necessarily the same transparency that every other company who is remote would get the same benefits from.
Yeah.
So, no, but
I haven't seen anything as transparent, honestly, and I was looking for that because it feels like everything is out on the table, but on the other hand, it's hard to manage as well on the back end, right? So it's not.
It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of commitment, and it does have some interesting consequences, which can be difficult to manage. And so again, like I have a tremendous amount of respect for that choice and the degree to which the consistency of that choice is present in their company. Like in some ways, you wouldn't want to I would not want to take a company that transparent until it was structurally and procedurally ready, because you can't, it's almost like if you go that direction, you have to stay there and have all the systems ready to make that work. If you kind of try to do it and don't do it thoroughly, it'll actually be worse.
I agree. And it's a promise as well. You can't go back on that promise.
That's right.
It will be hurting for sure.
That's right.
Now, you said leadership, culture, trust, care, right? You are hiring people and leaders, and you've hired them, people who have not worked remote before, who don't know how to manage remote. And most of what I've heard in this crisis is we're not trusting our people. We want them to be 100% on Zoom all the time. There are always meetings. I have friends working in HR who are literally nonstop in meetings, really trying to control what's happening out there, right? How do you get them from outside without all remote experience? And what kind of training, what kind of support do you give them so they can transition, embrace the culture, not only that, but model the culture afterwards so their people feel engaged, they share the same care, they share the same trust?
Oh boy. Yeah. I think if I knew the perfect answer to that question, I probably
this is what researchers tell
I'd
me
be a
as well.
popular guy. So my experience with remote leadership points to a few things, and I'll quote a former colleague of mine named Bjorn Freeman Benson, who was CTO at Envision for a while. He had the following observation. He thought that all remote work required a leader. If you have a director level job, for example, his opinion was, thinking like an engineer, use math, is you have to hire like a director +1 level up in terms of the capability of the leader coming in. And what he meant by that is remote work demands more from a leader than in-person work. I think he's right. So I'm not sure it's quite as mathematically simple as just if you need a director, go and hire a VP for the job at a remote company. It doesn't always work exactly perfectly like that. But I think his point is a really good one, which is it does require something extra. I think I know what that extra is, which is something that I would expand on what his kind of the Bjorn theorem is. Leadership, authentic and empathetic leadership shows up very, very well in remote, because it's almost the fuel that keeps your team from feeling isolated and ultimately from feeling alienated. So if I'm capable, or if the leaders in a company are capable of reaching through the digital screen and connecting and having the people on the other end feel seen and heard, it's kind of like that sparkle of energy that makes people feel like I'm here alone in my apartment or my home or wherever, but I know my leader cares about me, and that gives me a lot of ammunition and juice and energy to continue to show up remote. On the contrast, if a leader is not naturally adept at communicating in ways that help his or her employees feel seen and heard, it also can really show up. And so I've seen leaders who are strong leaders in almost every way, and who are strong leaders almost certainly in person. Some of those styles don't translate well to a remote environment. So, for example, there are leaders who are really effective, but in the way that they wander amongst their quote unquote troops and just be present, and people can cue off of them like, oh, they're kind of up today, they're energetic, but they're not necessarily great at the bonding level conversations when it comes to their employees. That unfortunately can really trip people up. It's almost like leadership communications and authenticity, directness, empathy is like almost at an extra premium. Our ability to do that as leaders remote is much more important. So those gaps show up really very quickly. So how can we help people? Well, for one, I think remote environments, it's important to go and get leaders who are strong in those ways and try to select for it. There's a lot of unfortunately a lot of problems with long-term performance or due to bad selection? Like, is this person going to be successful? So when you have people who are struggling, I think the key is to help them understand why they might be struggling and why they might be failing to connect with people on the other end of the call. And for me, the advice that I've given leaders and the training that both I and members of my former teams and my teams today focus on is, hey, like, slow down and make sure that in this environment you spend the time to connect. If you jump to procedure and if you jump to delegation and jump to issuing commands, you're missing an opportunity and also a need for people to feel like they're bonding with you. It's a really hard thing to get people to mentally switch on who are not accustomed to it, and it's really important.
Do you provide them with, I don't know, buddies in remote work? Someone who stays next to them and says, "You're too direct. You're giving too many procedures, too many commands." Do you pair them up with someone who's really good or not?
I mean, coach. So I'm a strong supporter of coaching in the right circumstances for someone who needs coaching help. Buddy programs sometimes work and sometimes just flop because it's optional, and sometimes your buddy knows how to help you, sometimes they don't. I think there probably is going to be a more and more important role for executive or managerial coaches who are not just coaching for generic skills, but coaching for being successful remote. And that's I was working with a friend of mine who is a public presentation and executive presence coach. And for him, this has been a real challenging time because he's used to going and working with people in person. And he's phenomenal at what he does. But he called me up and he said, "Hey, I have to do this piece of work now for a CEO, and I can't fly. Like, I can't fly to New York and meet them." I said, what would be different? Like, what's challenging for you about that? And he said, well, what I'm really doing in this environment is I'm doing media training. And he was focused on his anchor conceptually was, this is like a camera. I mean, it is a camera. I mean, I'm looking at a camera. But I said, hey, and his name is Russ. I said, Russ, I want you to reframe that because, yes, if we're preparing somebody for a televised interview in formal terms, then you're doing media training. But that's not what this person needs. This person just needs to be themselves in relationship with his employees over Zoom. Zoom isn't a formal medium. We work on Zoom. So you're just doing the same thing. What you have to do is adapt the work you're doing to a two-dimensional medium. And so we kind of thought about it differently and thought that, hey, all the stuff that we do to help people be comfortable leading other people applies here. You have to think about it as pixels. Like, you and I are pixels right now, Yulia, but that doesn't mean I can't get a feel for how this conversation is going, or doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it when you smile, and doesn't mean, I'm attentive to you as a person, even though I'm just watching like literally ones and zeros ultimately on a screen.
Definitely, but then your head translates it back into a three-dimensional discussion, right? If I listen to you, I can feel your energy. I can feel, hey, you are smiling, right? You're not upset. You are engaged in the conversation. You're focused. So I think listening and focusing, and I'm with you on this. I will ask Darren as well about the multitasking, but I'm with you on this. Focusing and really being present in a remote conversation makes it way better, at least for me.
Well, for the ones that I think, so I would say, because I do respect the opinions of, like, I'm in meetings sometimes and I multitask, and so I break my own rule. But the key for me is this a time where my primary objective is to create, sustain, or foster a better relationship? Like, would I sit across from you, like having coffee, and be on my laptop while we're talking? I mean, no, because I'm there to connect with you. If I'm there to connect with you, like, I'm going to be present and focus on you and focus on like hearing you and sharing ideas and the back and forth. If we're in a big conference room in person with 50 people and somebody is presenting PowerPoints, there's a pretty strong temptation, even in a physical room, to do something like, I don't blame people. Like it's something, you're actually getting information about the meeting. Like it's like, well, if I'm tempted to multitask, it's probably because what's happening right now isn't important for me.
Exactly, you shouldn't be there. But that's one of the issues with meetings, whether they're remote or face to face.
Exactly.
Who gets to attend?
Exactly.
Now, Mark, let me ask you. I have two a bit more technical questions because I've been speaking to researchers, right? And you will see every week we will have a new episode coming out. And one of them was about coordination, right? So they've been researching about 3 types of coordination. One was about modularization. So this is when you split the tasks of people in such a way that they don't have to collaborate remotely. The other one was ongoing communication, what's happening right now, which is more synchronous collaboration, right? When you're trying to really duplicate what's happening in the office, right? And really having people online nonstop so you can control what's happening. And then the third one that they figured out works really nicely is tacit coordination, right? Which is more using repositories, using asynchronous coordination. Now, what they're wondering and they're researching is what's the right mix of this? Because it feels like it's normal, it's not one or another.
Yep.
What would be your reflections on this? What did you see happening in the real world?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's harder to do with teams in a remote environment is using a formal term from business theory, mutual adjustment, like meaning calibration that happens not formally. Like I can bring everybody together who reports to me, or I can bring a project team together that reports to me, and I can issue a bunch of marching orders, and then everybody leaves the room. In a physical environment, you do have an advantage in that those people, as they walk back to their offices and desks, they're already processing. Like, so if I'm walking literally back to my desk with someone who is in that meeting, and there's a question I didn't think to ask in the meeting, right? And I just check with my colleague on the team, or I check with me as a team leader, and I say, hey, when you said blank, did you mean X or did you mean Y? And that takes 10 seconds. And I say, oh yeah, I meant Y. Right, okay. When we're all in person, I think we do have a greater tendency to mutually adjust and to calibrate, like I would say, like quickly calibrate or like informal calibration, because it's easier. Like I can pop my head out from my cubicle, or what I can just say, "Hey, are you working on that right now?" Now, that lends itself to quick adjustments, and I think we're probably more efficient doing those quick adjustments, generally speaking, in person. What we have to do in remote is we have to use technologies to do that. Now, of course, just literally the effort of having to type, having to open Slack or an email, like there are barriers to doing that in a remote environment that create friction. Like I think about, friction in an environment makes it harder or sometimes more painful or, more heated. And the quick calibration primarily, I think, in our day and age happens on Slack or Slack-like, or Teams, basically utilities for instant messaging. The problem, right, and this is what people often complain about, is that if we think of the metaphor as being we're all in a cubicle row, and I have a question of everybody who's working on the same stuff, and I literally pop my head out of the cubicle and I say, Yulia, are you working on this thing right now? Can I ask you a question? Now, I would see if you are on a phone call, right? And I wouldn't pop my head out and start speaking to you. Our instant messaging, programs, while there are various technical things that I can do to signal that I'm busy or in a meeting, or a lot of people don't do that with regularity. A lot of people ignore it anyway. And so there's this constant barrage of, like, I may be in a meeting, but you're still asking me a calibration question. That leads to a delay, like literally a delay loop. So I'm in a meeting, you Slack me, you say, hey, Mark, was it X or Y when you talked about it at the meeting? And you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And you wait, not because I don't care about you, but because I'm busy and you can't see that I'm busy, or because I haven't put on in a meeting or busy or away from desk. And then you wait, and you have to stop working, right? So you're not working on that thing now, and you're like, and you begin to get a little frustrated, like, because we expect, of course, instant response, like from these two technologies. So it does create like more friction and more time delays, and ultimately I think more bottlenecking on quick calibration stuff. My solve, which I think is the best solve you get, really, is I try to be as transparent and inclusive as possible and communicate more than I would otherwise communicate in an in-person environment. So it's almost like when I create delegation, I risk giving people way more than they would need if I were meeting, which can almost sound sometimes like over I mean, not micromanaging, but like over supervising. Like here's everything that you're going to do. You are going to get this. You are going to get this. You're going to get like it's very, very specific, and it's sometimes very, very detailed. I have found that generally speaking prevents some of the mutual adjustment delays from creeping in, even though they still happen. You're like over communicating what you need from a project at the front end, which does allow people to have the clarity. Like even in in-person stuff, people often walk away from delegation. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. In remote, it's even more of a risk. So, I mean, the answer, I guess at the end of the day, the answer is communication, but sometimes people say that and it's a little bit pithy. It's like, well, what do you mean communicate? It's really practicing being as specific and clear and even over communicating, especially when you ask people to do things. Because you can't see that they walk away confused. Like, hey, this is what you're going to do. You nod because you're my report, and you nod because I'm asking you to do it. And then you're puzzled an hour later, but you're like, oh, he's busy probably. I'm not going to ask him. And then days go by, right?
Definitely. So do you get into the situation where people blame others that they are not replying very quickly, that they are not on time on meetings? And how do you counter that? Because I imagine that happens as well, right? And usually if it's remote, at least this is what the guys I've been talking with said so far, it's always an us versus them because you're not feeling them closely, right? You've never met them. Yeah. And then you can get to conclusions that, it's Spanish, of course, he's always late 5 minutes, right? And then usually it becomes personal rather than really logistical or understanding that person actually had some issues.
I think... So what I've observed is the remote environment can create situations where people take one cue from a certain specific incident and they write their story of that person or that behavior, and they write it much more concretely than they would otherwise. So here's a very quick example. You get on a call with your manager. Your manager's having a bad day, or maybe even a bad hour, and she is huffy or upset, and as that manager is talking to you, you get the feeling that you are in trouble, that you've done something wrong. You walk away from that meeting and you're like, is my job at risk? Have I failed? Okay. What you don't see is half a day later, or like literally hours later, that manager is walking to the lunchroom and seems, smile on her face, energized, engaged, and you recalibrate. You're like, oh, right. And you start to wonder whether that was you or not. And what you also didn't see was in the morning, that particular manager has a whole bunch of complications with taking their children, from home to daycare, and they weren't ever upset at you. It was just a really difficult morning, and so they come into the meeting and they're upset. Like you didn't see any of that happen. All you see is the half-hour one-on-one, and you write a script it must be about me. So the risks with the remote is that it's so easy to take a small cue behaviorally and believe that that is everything that is happening in the world for that person. And you don't see any of the context. We do get a lot of that context in person. So the remedy there, I think, is first to slow down and stop and connect at the beginning of remote calls. So some of the practices that we tried to do at Envision, and I'm trying to do with my team that remote here at Lambda, is like try to always start a Zoom meeting with something that's humanly connective. How is it going? Like just small things. Like don't launch into the business of the meeting. We don't do that when we're in person. Let's not do it in Zoom. and try to make sure if you're worried about the emotional state or the thoughts that are happening, that you're getting this impression that maybe something is off, check. Like, we got to get really good at being open with each other, because the tendency of the digital medium is it compresses everything and this doesn't give us a lot of space. So peel it back up and say, like, are you like, hey, Yulia, it looks like maybe you're like, are you okay? Like, get curious about these things so we don't end up having these scripts about people. And I think that's the way to get through it.
True. Maybe at the end of this pandemic, we will get out with some really good behaviors, like really being transparent, asking questions,
I hope so.
giving feedback. I hope so as well. I really, truly hope so.
I mean, if that, I mean, not that we needed a pandemic to help us do that, but the way I see it is that the way you have to work remotely to be a good team member, leader, employee, customer, client, everything about remote just makes it harder to be humanly connective. So you got to work those muscles a lot harder.
Yeah.
I hope working those muscles really hard makes you just a better person. I think it does. So if we have to do that and practice that, I mean, I also know, unfortunately, that there's a lot more incidents of domestic abuse right now because of the situation, at least in the United States. So you're seeing the opposite end of the spectrum, which is when people don't have any outlet and they're forced into close quarters, other bad things happen. So what I think it's revealing is that we still have a long way to go as a species to be kind to each other.
I will have a discussion with Mark van Vugt from the Frein Universiteit here in Amsterdam. He's a psychologist, and then we will talk about how working remote really goes against our nature, and working in close quarter goes against our nature, right? It's not how we are supposed to, or it's not how we grew up. So I'm kind of curious about that conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Yeah. I would say, I guess maybe I'm a futurist in this regard, but I'm not sure what human nature is exactly. I think, there's human conditioning.
Yeah.
And then there's human adaptation. I think there are people for whom, increasingly, there are people in this economy, in the tech sector economy, for whom isolation is the norm. And if you ask them to go into an office with a lot of people, they are uncomfortable. And I think, 50 years from now, it might be really, really awkward for some people. Hey, you have to come and meet people face to face. They might be very uncomfortable about that because this is their comfort zone. So, we're a funny animal in that we adapt around our technology pretty fast.
Yeah. Faster than sometimes you would think, right? It's really happening extremely fast. Yes. I was talking yesterday. I have another technical question with another researcher, and then I promised her that I will ask someone who's actually putting this in practice, right? Her research is really pioneering, and it talks about cultural and temporal brokerage in distributed work. So pretty much what's happening is that if you put a person in a team that is multicultural, let's say American and Brazilian, right? And that particular person has worked with both cultures 4 or 5 years and so on, then they become these cultural brokers where the other team members rely on them to translate what's happening, right? And then you can have, these are called insiders because they've witnessed both cultures. But then you have outsiders as well, someone who maybe worked in France and Romania. And then they can still broker that relationship in multicultural teams because they know and they can ask the right questions. So the teams reveal what's happening, right? And it happens the same in temporal brokerage. Apparently, if there's a person sitting somewhere in the middle time-wise, right? Let's say Europe, when you deal with America and Asia, then they take on that integration role because the other parts cannot really collaborate, right? It takes them more time to do it, right? So they need a bit more slack. But on the other hand, they also can bring up way more value because they're able to integrate that knowledge and they gain that integration capacity as well. Now, she knows this because she's running research on it, but she has never discussed with any company that has worked all remote. Did you witness the same kind of brokerage in terms of culture and time in all remote companies where you work really distributed?
Yeah, the time one's interesting. Like I'm not by choice, but I happen to be in Central Time in the US, and I've I've often found it's the best, it's the easiest time zone to deal with. I had teammates and colleagues who were on Pacific, and Envision was, if anything, slightly tilted towards Eastern time. But really, we tried to eliminate, at least across the United States, time zone disparities by focusing the workday on the middle part of the day for the most part. But I always felt like I had the best of every, I come right dead center. The brokerage angle is interesting. I think that, I would almost think of it like pivot points where there's lag. There's so when I think about time zones and remote work, it's almost like this wave that moves across a geography. And so the folks, at least speaking only about the US for a second, the wave kicks off at about 8:00 a.m. Eastern time, and people obviously in Pacific Coast are almost all asleep, and work begins to generate. And if I think of the aggregate work, the work generates and creates this backlog. And as the backlog grows, what happens when you wake up on Pacific Coast is there's already all this work, waiting for you, and you're digging out of your debt, for the first part of your day, and then you're finishing your day and creating debt overnight for, back for the other coast. And I traveled quite a bit. Like I go to Vancouver, Canada every summer to visit my wife's family, and I will work there. And my experience of working on Pacific time versus Central time versus Eastern time is radically different. And I have to approach my day radically different. So I think that one of the keys to, I'd have to see her research to know how to comment exactly on her thesis about the people. But what I think is true is you need a blend, and you need ways that this wave doesn't just crash. Like imagine if you had a whole group of East Coast workers who are only focused on their time zone, and Pacific Coast workers only focused on, you'd have this wave of billing every day, smashing into the Pacific, and then repeating and smashing back on East Coast. I think where you have work that's more, where you create some norms about, hey, don't release, unless it's very specific code development that has specific management of releases, don't just create this wave of work for somebody as soon as they wake up. Oh, I'm behind already. So be cognizant of that. And I try to train my teams to be at least cognizant of that backlog that you create. I'll have to think a little bit more about both of those. The cultural one is, I think generally yes. I don't know if it works any different remote and in person. I think that's always the key.
That's not the difference, right? It's just that it exists, and then what she proved basically that having this cultural brokers improves the performance of the team. And it improves creativity, it improves their innovation, it improves just generally their performance, because there's someone to mediate the relationship, so conflicts don't end up happening as often as, or they get
absolutely.
Very quickly.
That is absolutely the case also in remote companies, maybe even more pronounced in some ways. I think about it both in terms of international diversity, but also just even in ethnic and gender diversity and other questions of difference. The teams that I manage that have strong diversity, but also a very deep sense of inclusivity, are much higher engaged, and much easier, I think, to feel seen and heard and be a strong participant in.
I will, if you're okay, I will send you her research. Her name is Sujin Yang.
Course.
She's an assistant professor at INSEAD. Really, really, truly interesting. And it's really pioneering because no one has researched this before. So all her papers are quite new, 2018, 2020.
Yeah,
really
sure.
interesting. Perfect.
Thank
I'll
you.
do that. I had a question from LinkedIn. Actually, multiple questions, but they led to the same question for you.
Yep.
Customers. A lot of people are used to dealing with customers face-to-face, going to meetings, impressing them by their presence. How do you deal with them all remotely? Do you have any solution to that? Anything that works?
I think part of what you do is you train them on this new reality. So that's one thing at Envision we really got used to, is we would have customers that were not comfortable with remote. You almost you almost train them. So it starts with, hey, let's you're not going to be able to meet face to face. So sometimes people are, they don't. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're using Zoom or another technology, but it's almost, let's just jump on a phone call. Like that's fine, but next time could we try a video call? And then they're like, oh, well, sure. And then you help them adjust to the medium. And increasingly people are getting more and more comfortable with this. Obviously, the circumstance we're in right now is making people comfortable with video who weren't. But it's almost as if you are saying, let's practice working together this way, and being flexible, because obviously I've had clients and I've had relationships where people just don't to struggle being video connected, and either if we're not going to meet in person, phone is their medium. I try to explain to them why this is an improvement. Why sometimes I'll be happy to have a voice conversation, but seeing you is great for is fun. It helps me. It's more connecting. It was more connecting. We get to build our relationship. I have it's so funny. I have a financial advisor who lives in downtown Austin. He's great. He's very old school. Like whenever we're going to meet, he wants me to drive downtown and park and go and sit in the office, even if I'm going down for half an hour and signing some papers. He's just very, he's a little older than I am, and it's for him. That's what it means to relate to a customer, right? I've gradually tried to help it, like, hey, you want to try a video call? And I can't quite get him there yet, but it's almost sort of trying to say, like, live this way for me. Like, just try this. And I think with customers, right now we're all forced to, and we will be for a little bit while longer. But when we're back to the physicality, it's not only a reasonable way to relate, but it also is less expensive. Like if I'm a professional service provider and I'm saying, hey, Yuli, I'm going to come and do some work with you, and I'm going to fly to Amsterdam, and here's, $2,000 reimbursement, part to my bill. If you're conscious that this can work, as a customer, you're going to be like, hey, let's have a Zoom call instead. I mean, that's a lot less expensive. So there's times when I will want to, even post-COVID, go and see people, and that's not going to change. The one thing that I find is really hard to do in a deep way is build very, very deep trust. You can work on trust, you can build a relationship. What I do with my teams anyway is I will still bring them together frequently enough, literally, for us just to sit in a room together and then go out and eat. Like just to create deeper relationships, because it's almost what I get in those moments is well worth the travel expense. So there'll be times I want to see my customer, but I can gradually say, like, hey, it's easier for both of us and it's cheaper for both of us. Let's try it out for a little bit.
Mark, you have been asked a lot of questions by a lot of people. You've written articles. Is there something that you always wanted to say or always wanted to be asked and no one asked you about remote work?
I guess a question I've never been asked, or maybe in this way, would be, why isn't it more fun to be? Isn't it just more fun and pleasurable to be in person, with other people? And I know that's a good question. Like, I wouldn't want to be remote from my family. When I go on a trip, when I go on a work trip, not these days, but when I get on a plane, I hate being away. Like, I just, and getting on the video call is not good enough. I have a daughter in her 20s, and she lives in a different city, and I get on remote and we say hi, and it's not, doesn't take the place of her traveling to visit, or me traveling there. So, on a certain level, like, even though I guess I'm a remote evangelist, I would never be one to say I can replace my life with a screen. I don't want to, I have no intention, nor would I want to. And the idea of replacing my human connections across the board with a screen, is kind of horrific to me. So even it's funny, like, despite what I've said and wrote, like I have no intention of replacing my human connections on screen. So no, I think what we have to remember is that there's going to be relationships in our lives that cannot be replicated through the screen and through remote. And that tells you something. It means that, well, there's also going to be, it's harder to sustain and to have good work relationships remote. And I agree, it is harder. The interesting thing is that being remote actually allows us to create some interesting different trades on that. Remote working does let me maximize more time with my family. I'm not commuting. I see my girls when they come home from school. Like, so for me, it is a trade that allows me to be more present physically for people that I care about. And while I'm not as present for people in the office, like for me, it's on balance, I'd prefer it that way. I do think that, there's gains and losses with any technology. It's not like having remote is completely maximally better across the board. Having remote gives us different choices. And it almost reminds us about what it means to be a human being and what it means to be connected and in person. So in some ways, remote has allowed me to stay connected with like friends that I don't see very frequently. And for that, I am so thankful, because I can see them and I can hang with them and we can, enjoy activities together. And they live in New York, or they live in Wisconsin, or they live in Vancouver, or wherever. It doesn't mean that I don't want to see them again, like in person. It actually reminds me that I get to still have a relationship. And if we didn't have these technologies, I'd probably lose touch with them. So, I'm so thankful that it creates a conduit, but it doesn't take the place, of in-person lived experience. And I guess that's both the benefit, but I personally have no intention of kind of retreating into an all remote life. It's just a way to relate that actually allows me to relate much more broadly and spread out.
Mark, thank you so much for today.
Of course.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your involvement, your engagement, and your energy. It was really great fun.
A pleasure. Thank you for asking me.